Hey everybody, iPenguin Pat here, and today we are going to talk about one of my favorite stats in the whole game, the duration of beneficial effects increase stat. This stat, I believe, should be rolled on every piece of gear that you have because it's just that good. I also want to talk about some mistaken myths that may have been passed around, potentially by me, about there being a hidden cap.
Right, of course. Yeah, my bad, silly.
And now want to share my results with you. So to start with, if you are looking for a quick answer, is there a cap to the beneficial effect duration? My short answer is no, I do not believe there is. I have tested up to over 63% duration increase, and I have seen no signs of there being a cap. If that's all you were looking for, then please like and subscribe and comment below that that was all you needed so that the algorithm still loves me. And if you are interested in the data and how it all adds up and works out, then stick around because there's also a few other little things that I found out about Vithus and stacking and parties that I didn't know and frankly aren't really obvious with the way the descriptions are written. So with no further ado, let's get over to that spreadsheet and see what we found out. But wait, one quick thing before getting into the spreadsheet is how I went about this, the methodology. And basically I went around and to start with I had done a variety of skills running around the open world, killing stuff and testing things like Wrath and Vengeance and Zeal and all those kinds of things. But for my second round of tests, I focused primarily on two things that I knew the duration amounts for. Ice Shield, because I know that that is an 8-second duration, and then the Vithus 4-piece bonus. We know that that is a 3-second duration. So those were the primary ones. And then the speed buff that we get for doing Siphon is a 1-second buff. So based off of those, that's how we did all of the calculations. And furthermore, we have done some testing and determined that the duration actually starts the frame before the buff shows up in the buff bar, and it ends the frame after the buff disappears from the buff bar. When we look and determine the duration based off of that, our numbers match what we would expect much more closely than any other way. The spreadsheet of madness strikes again. Alright, so let's just do a quick tour of the spreadsheet and what's here, and then I'll break down the data. So I moved some stuff around to make it easier to read from the first round of data that was collected. And I also got a little bit better strategy for measuring. Our measured duration is here in this first column in B, and this matches up with all of the various abilities that were used as buffs. We have the base duration, which is what is the known stated duration of the ability. We have the duration for gear and for the reforge, primarily because I wanted to know if those were treated separately or if they are merged together and smushed together. Now, for the PvE testing, this did not seem to matter. However, we will be doing further testing when we do the PvP to see if the PvP debuff affects these equally or different. We have the set duration, which is our own Vithus, and then we have the party duration, which means that the person who was buffing us had a 2-piece Vithus set to increase the duration. Then we have the total sum of what the expected duration extension should be. And going from there, we just do some conversions measuring between frames and seconds. And basically, you'll notice that these are written in frame notation instead of seconds, and that's just because it makes it a lot more accurate for recording the data. But when we go to make calculations and comparisons, seconds are easier to work with, so we convert the frames into seconds. From there, we do our percentages, and then we have measured versus buffed. Basically, what this measured versus buffed is telling us is whether or not we measured the same amount as what we would expect from buffed. If we are at 100% exactly, that means that we got exactly what we expected. If we are below 100%, that means we got less than we expected. And if we are above 100%, that means we got more than what the buff seemed like it should give. So we did see some very consistent numbers that were being above the buff duration, and that made me very curious. I'm really excited to show you what I found out. Let's zoom in a little bit and let me show you some of our findings. First, we have it sorted by the buff applied so that we're able to quickly compare apples to apples, and then the measured versus buffed so that we can quickly identify areas where the buff was underperforming or overperforming, and maybe identify something that is wrong or out of place. And the thing that immediately stood out to me when I was looking at this, besides the really bright reds, which I'll get to in a minute, are how the Vithus was consistently much lower than expected across a lot of the duration. And what I figured out after doing a little bit of testing with Yogi is that when the buff applies for Vithus depends on what type of buff is triggering the Vithus. So when you see this here where it says Alt Vithus, that means that I started measuring the duration of Vithus when the initial buff started, not when the Vithus icon showed up. So here you can see like Conjuration of Light versus Consecration. And what I noticed is that when you're dealing with something like a Holy Banner or a Consecration, where the buff is applied based off of proximity or a standing on a location or something like that, then the time for Vithus immediately starts the second either like the Holy Banner or the Consecration buff hits the ground. So in a case like Conjuration of Light or Ice Armor, where the buff is immediately applied, there's not any sort of in-between for deciding when the buff starts. In that particular case, Vithus duration doesn't actually start until the buff shows up in the buff bar. It's a little bit more of a delay, which is actually a little bit counterintuitive. I would have thought the direct buffs would have been faster than the ground buffs, but that is not the case. So nevertheless, so when you see these variations with the Vithus being less than it should be, or even things like the Bottled Hope, same deal. Any of this duration that is less than it's supposed to be, that is more indicative of when the buff should be measured and not so much indication that the duration was not increased as it should be. So with that out of the way, let's look at the next elephant in the room, and that is these buffs here that are over 60% duration that are underperforming dramatically. Now, in my previous video, if you weren't one of the few people who were lucky enough to see it and see the wrong data that I presented, you would have seen that I was talking about how being over the 60%, there was some weird debuff, but that's not actually what was happening. What was happening is that the Vithus set does not apply to buffs that are given to you by another party member. That's right. If you have a party member that applies a buff, let's say Sprint, for example, or Conjuration of Light, something like that, and they are not using the two-piece Vithus set, then you will not get a 30% duration increase. And you'll notice that these right here are what are causing this over here to be messed up. When I delete those, you see that these come back more into line with what they're supposed to be. They're much closer to the percentages they're supposed to be. And that tells us that the set duration from Vithus does not affect buffs that are given to you by other players. It only is effective if they have the Vithus. It does not help you if you have it. And that made me wonder about things like shrines. And it turns out that shrines are also not affected by the Vithus duration increase. So we can definitively see that the duration increase that you get from Vithus and the duration benefit that you get from your gear are treated separately. And that also kind of makes sense because that's what we're expecting to see when we look at the PvP, not included in this video, but coming soon. Subscribe if you want to find out when it's ready. And in addition to that, when I had a quick test on the Isitar set, I also found that the buff did not get any benefit from Vithus either. And that I found to be especially peculiar because I do know that Vithus Urge does self-buff, but for whatever reason, the Isitar set buff does not seem to apply. I'm going to end up doing more testing on that, and I may have just recorded it wrong or something weird like that. But whatever the case, I can confidently say that Vithus does not apply to shrines, and I would expect that it does not apply to the globes, like the quickening globe or the lightning globes, whatever they're called. And finally, to finish addressing the red measured buffs, let's look at Siphon for just a second. Now, if you're not a wizard, you may not know, but Siphon is basically just a small speed buff that you can get as a wizard. I think the primary reason that we're seeing this really big decrease or this big lack of buff compared to what it should be is just the fact that this is just such a small amount that being off by even 1 frame can really jack up the numbers. For example, if this were even 1 frame longer, that would get us pretty close to where it needs to be. And if it were 2 frames longer, we would actually be well above what the expected amount was. Basically, the point being that because these numbers are so small and they're so easily altered and the percentages are changed by so much by even just 1 or 2 frames, I don't really see that as being particularly concerning. That's more of just the fact that it's just a super small sample size and all. I would be considerably more concerned if we were looking at something like an 8-second duration or even a 3-second duration and it was underperforming by 30 or 40%. Now that we've addressed the underperforming, let's start talking about performing on par or even overperforming, because I think that's really where most of us want to be. So as a quick look, Ice Armor is going to be one of our best examples because we know the base duration is 8 seconds and we are in full control over when that starts and ends. Now we do see that there were a handful of cases where Ice Armor was under what it was supposed to be, and in most of these cases the buff duration was a relatively small percentage, this one being the only one where we saw like kind of a bigger amount off. And based off of all this, it's primarily just that we're just short a few frames. I mean, we're only going up 8 or 9 or 12%. That's really where we see this being significantly under. Then we have this nice stretch where we are solidly right where we're supposed to be, right? And notice that for this stretch, we are mostly under 30% duration. There's a couple of exceptions. Generally speaking, if we are under 30% duration, we're pretty much on point. Now, what gets interesting is when we start going over the 30% duration, that we start seeing a noticeable increase in the measured versus buffed. So basically, as I had actually started to acknowledge and notice in my previous video, is that the more you stack your buff duration, the more it seemed like you started to get out of it. Like you started to overperform past what you would expect based off of the numbers there. The extra exciting news, especially if you were worried about there being a hidden cap, is you can see that not only is there no hidden cap, but in fact, by going over 50 or even 60, you're not just getting that full amount, but you're actually overperforming by a pretty good amount. If you're at about 63% buff duration, you're almost 10% more performance than what you would expect. And just like Ice Armor, we see the same type of trend with Siphon. You get more and more benefit the more and more you go above that 30% mark. You see right here is that 30% and we're being at about break even. And as we push up into higher numbers, we get more and more. As I mentioned before, here with these smaller numbers, that does also put us in a position where we can just have variance because it's just such a small amount of frames. I mean, adding 1 frame or dropping 1 frame can definitely throw things off. But when you look at the consistency, the ones that are underperforming are going to be primarily the ones that are under 30%, and the ones that are overperforming are primarily the ones that are over 50%. So yeah, stacking buff duration is absolutely a win. The next thing I want to look at is party buffs. Now, what we're looking at here in the red, these are all buffs that were provided by Yogi and the measurements on how those were applied in-game. Here you can see that there are some extremely profound and huge above expected numbers, and there are some extremely profound and way below expected numbers. So let's do a quick look and see how these apply. Now, when you look at these 5 items that wildly underperformed, there is one common thread among them all, and that is my Vithus, right? Like this right here is exactly what was causing that, because my Vithus is not applying to her buffs, which kind of sucks, but that is the case. Here you can see as soon as I delete that, that brings all of those numbers back in line, or at least close to within line of what you would expect. But the other interesting and curious thing is just how fantastic we see some of these durations go off. Here you're seeing things at 110%, 112%. Why are we seeing those numbers? And we did a few quick tests to see.
It's called a hypothesis.
And here's how it goes. So to start with, you have the base duration of the ability, and I'm going to convert that to frames just to make it easier. And then we will apply the Vithus. And then after we apply the Vithus, then we apply our own self buffs. So this is a little bit different because that means that our self buffs are actually multiplying a larger number than the base number. So with our original calculations, we would have taken the 30% from Vithus and added the 15 to make it a 45% multiplier. But that's not actually how it plays out. The way that this ended up working out was we did the 30%, and then after we did the 30%, we did another 15%, which gave us a slightly higher number. Now, it's not an astronomically huge number, but it adds up pretty quickly, especially when you start getting into numbers like 30% extra on top of it. And this number here matches suspiciously well with the predicted frames that we see here. And while this may not be a huge number, it does amount to a pretty decent amount as you go up. And again, as your base duration, as the duration that you're getting from your gear and from your reforge gets higher and higher, you will get more and more benefit from this calculation setup. As usual, I will make my work available, and if you would like to play with the spreadsheet or add your own information, you can come up here to File and then either make a copy or download in the format that you prefer, and that way you can edit and play with this without messing up the original data. Alright guys, that's all I have for buff duration increase. Now, the great news is that not only is there no cap to the buff duration, but in fact, there is a benefit to stacking extra buff duration, because when you have Vithus, you actually get an additional multiplier extra beyond what you would expect based on the numbers. Also, keep in mind that your Vithus does not apply to buffs given to you by other players or by shrines or by globes. The only the buff duration increase that you have on your gear and reforged applies to those items. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and if you found this to be helpful at all, please like and subscribe, and I will catch you in the next video.